So you're ready to give knitting a try and you want to tackle your first project. In this tutorial, I'll walk you through a full scarf step by step. That's coming up. My name is Brittany and I'm your guide to better crochet and knitting because I believe yarn does more than make pretty things. I craft because it occupies my hands and it calms my mind. I love the process and something pretty is the result. I want that for you too. Here, we love yarn, we love to learn, and we truly believe yarn can do more for us than make pretty things. With your first color, we need to create a foundation, a process called casting on. Now, there are different ways to cast on, but as a complete beginner, the long tail cast on really is the easiest. So that's what we'll do. So get 24 inches of slack and drape that over one of your needles. Hold on to that with your finger and gather the yarn in your other hand. Use your last 3 fingers to hold on to both strands at the bottom, and to cast on one stitch using the long tail cast on, pull the needle down to catch the loop on your thumb, wrap it around to catch the loop on your index finger, and release the thumb loop over the tip of the needle. That's 1 stitch cast on. For this pattern, you'll cast on a total of 16 stitches. After you have these stitches on your needle, your work should look something like this, but don't worry if your loops aren't perfect. Making even stitches is a part of the learning process. All right, now that you have your foundation, you can knit the first row. Turn your needle and insert the other one into the first loop from front to back. Make sure to keep your tail yarn out of the way so you don't accidentally knit with it. And grab the yarn coming from the ball of yarn, which by the way is called the working yarn. You'll make a loop around the needle with the working yarn, hold the tension a little bit and carefully slip that needle down and through the first loop. That's how you create a knit stitch. We use this stitch throughout the entire process and it'll get easier the more you do it. There are different ways to hold the yarn in the needles, but for your first project, this is the best way to get the hang of it. As you get more comfortable with the motions, you might keep the working yarn in your hand along the needle to make it a little easier. But honestly, don't worry about this yet. Don't worry about speed either. You'll get faster the more you do this. Right now, let's just focus on making these stitches consistent. When you get to the end of the row, set your empty needle aside and turn your work so that you can knit in the same direction with that free needle. Keep doing this, knitting every stitch, then flipping your scarf and knitting some more. And after you've knit a few rows, it'll look something like this. Again, don't worry if it isn't perfect. You should see how bad my first scarf looked. I really wish I had it here so I could show you. Keep going until your scarf measures about 11 inches from your starting edge. When you reach this point, you're probably getting the hang of the stitch and you may even be getting bored with all of these same motions. So let's change it up a little bit. Adding a new color makes it seem like a whole new project, so rather than diving into a different stitch before you might be ready for it, let's just add a second color. Trim your first color, leaving a tail that's about 6 inches long. Then insert your needle into the first stitch just as you usually would and leave it there. Loop your new color so you have another long tail and place that on your knitting needle. Pull it through the stitch and that's your first stitch completed with the new color. Now it's also a good idea to tie these two ends together in a knot especially for this first row, so it makes it a little bit easier to knit and it doesn't get too loose on you. We'll fix these tails later. Now at this point, you're probably getting comfortable with the knitting motions and maybe you want to knit a little bit faster. There are two methods of holding the yarn for faster knitting: flick knitting and continental knitting, with the major difference between the two being which hand you hold the working yarn in. To flick knit, gather the yarn in your dominant hand, looping it around your pinky and your index finger. When you're ready to yarn over for that knitting motion, you just move your index finger so the yarn catches the needle and you pull it through as you normally would. To knit continental style, gather the yarn in your non-dominant hand and grab the yarn through the stitch. This works best if you open the stitch up a little bit with your finger behind the work. Now, in the style of knitting you're most comfortable working in, continue knitting in this new color until you reach the end of your skein. It'll measure about 48 inches at that point from your starting edge when it's slightly stretched out. And what I did here was switch back to my first color and knit a section that's the same length as that first gray section. But you can get creative with your color work here. You can do whatever striping pattern you want. The goal is that the scarf measures somewhere about 60 inches when slightly stretched when it's complete. Now to finish the scarf, we first need to bind these stitches off the needles. So to do that, knit the first and the second stitch, then pass that first stitch over the second one. Then you'll knit the next stitch, pass the first one over, and repeat until you have only one loop left on your needle. Trim the yarn and pull that tail up to fasten off the stitch. And finally, let's take care of these ends. Alright, that wraps up this B.Hooked tutorial, the place where we love yarn, we love to learn, and we believe yarn can do more for us than just make pretty things. Subscribe for continued progress, and I'll see you in the next one.